Good morning. We are studying in the book of 1 Samuel. And I show we got to chapter 20. So we'll pick up with chapter 20, verse 1. We've noticed thus far that David and Saul are, I don't know if I'd say at odds. Saul is at odds with David. It's not David being at odds with King Saul so much as it's Saul being at odds with David. David has been anointed and told he's going to be the next king. He's not told he's not told when he's going to be the next king. He's just told that he's going to be. So, we've talked about this, and not to get ahead, but you know, if you've studied this before, David is even going to have an opportunity. In fact, we'll probably get to one of them today, maybe not, where he's going to have an opportunity, and then later on another opportunity to actually kill Saul and take over. It's and some of his men actually say to him, "Hey, here's your chance. God's delivered him into your hand. Kill him, and then you take over as king." I mean, that's how it worked in all the world, right? I mean, one king rules and another king wants to rule. So if he can take him out, he took him out, and that's how it worked. But David, over and over again, says, "I'm not going to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed." So picking up in chapter 20. Saul's persecution of David has already begun. You're going to see more of that here in chapter 20. It says David is fleeing from Naioth. He went to see Samuel, and he came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? What's my sin?" In other words, like anyone who is innocent, what have I done that your father, he's speaking to Jonathan, of course, what have I done that your father is so bent on killing me? Have I done something wrong? Have I offended him in some way? Of course, he hasn't. And I think he probably deep down knows that. He's just, we would say, covering all the bases, and maybe even driving home the point to Jonathan that I haven't done anything. Jonathan knew that. They were friends, of course. And so Jonathan says, and again, the chronology here may not be in chronological order, because earlier Jonathan had kind of tested out Saul, sounded out, as the King James puts it, but here it seems like that's going to happen again. So it could be out of chronological order, or maybe now that he asked before, and maybe things have settled down, and Jonathan is thinking, no, surely not. He said he's changed his mind. He said he's not going to seek your life. But anyway, be that as it may, Jonathan says, "God forbid, you shall not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, great or small, but he'll show it to me. Why should my father hide this thing from me?" It's not so. He says, no, he doesn't want to kill you. And David says, "Your father knows I've found grace in your eyes." And that may be an insight, if this is chronological, that may be some insight to explain it. It seems Saul, knowing Jonathan is friends with David, now has changed his tune a little bit, as we say in the South. He's changed his tune a little bit, so maybe he's speaking nicely of David to Jonathan, and so Jonathan thinks, no, my father doesn't want to kill you. But David, maybe in private, has been, had the javelin, as the King James puts it, spear would be the idea, thrown at him, or multiple attempts on his life. So it may be that he's saying one thing to David, one thing to Jonathan, or another thing to Jonathan, rather. So he says, your father knows I found grace in your eyes. He says, "Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly," David says, "as the Lord liveth and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death." So David says to Jonathan, I'm just a step from being in the grave. Jonathan says to David, what are you asking of me? Whatever you need, I'll help you. And that's what a friend does, of course. If it's within their power, they're going to help. And so he says to David, "Tell me what you need, and I'm going to try to help." David says, Tomorrow's the new moon. I should not fail to sit with the king at meat, but let me go, that I may hide myself in the field unto the third day at evening. Even, the King James says, or evening. So he says, if thy father all miss me, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me that he might run to Bethlehem, this city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he say thus, it is well, thy servant shall have peace, but if he be very wroth, then be sure that evil is determined by him. He says, by this you'll deal kindly with your servant, for you've brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with thee, notwithstanding if there be in me iniquity. David says to Jonathan, if there's in me any wrongdoing, kill me yourself. For why should you bring me to your father? David says, it reminds us of Paul later on in the book of Acts. He's got to be standing before a council and even before the Romans, and he says, if I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But he knew he had not. And so David himself says, if I've done wrong, Jonathan, you just take care of this right here and now. And don't even bother taking me to your father. And of course, Jonathan says, far be it from me, or far be it from thee, for if I knew certainly that evil were determined by my father to come upon thee, would not I tell it thee? So David says to Jonathan, who's going to tell me, or what if he answers roughly? So they're trying to come up with a plan. How are we going to figure this out if he's upset? Because if Saul's upset and he wants to kill him, then they've got to be discreet about this because, number one, he's going to be looking for David. Number two, David is concerned about, he doesn't want Saul to turn on Jonathan either because that's his friend. So he says, let's go into the field. Jonathan does. They went out, both of them, into the field. Jonathan tells David, when I've sounded my father, I'm going to test him, find out about tomorrow anytime or the third day. Behold, if there's good toward David, I then send not unto thee and show it thee. So he's going to find out. The Lord do so much more to Jonathan, but if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it thee and send thee away that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. So he says, I'm going to let you know either way. And then he says, you shall not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. I want to back up just a little bit before we get into this plan that they came up with. David, he's going to miss this feast. And it's a sacrificial meal day under the law of Moses. So David's not going to be there, and he tells Jonathan to say what? He's gone to Bethlehem to be with. A lot of people have and they'll say things like, well, there are situations where it's okay for you to tell a lie. And I think you have to remember when you study this section, like with other sections of Scripture as well, just because the Bible records something doesn't mean it condones it, right? David But did it make it okay to tell a lie? There's never an indication that God was pleased with David. God have saved David even with him telling the truth? Obviously. God had told him he was going to be king. Now, the flip side of that coin is, bear in mind, David is, just like you and me, he's a human. And if you're running for your life, literally, none of us, I dare say, most of us, if not all of us, has not a clue what it is like to be fleeing from someone who literally, given the chance, is going to murder you. David is in that situation, and he's probably grasping at straws, so to speak, trying to come up with some way. It doesn't make it okay. He lied, and it's still wrong. But at the same time, all these heroes in the Bible, they're human. And they make mistakes the same as you and I make mistakes. And sometimes they get in a situation and in desperation, they make a mistake. Sometimes they get on top of the world and maybe they let their guard down a little bit and they make mistakes. That's going to happen with David later, of course. And sometimes just in the depths of despair, they mess up. They're human. So bear that in mind. Does the Bible condone this? No, absolutely not. But the Bible is clear that all the heroes therein are human, just like us. And I think there's encouragement that we can take from that. That, to be a hero of faith doesn't mean to be sinless. It means following God and growing and getting better and better and striving each day to be better than the day before. And that's what you see in David's life. He didn't always do that. There were times when he would have a setback, but he didn't let that keep him down. He would stumble, but he's always going to get back up and keep walking with God. You going to say something, Jimmy? Yeah. Yeah, and that's another question. Why so determined to stay in Jerusalem? And it may be his friendship with Jonathan, which he seems pretty clear that's not going to be able. They're not going to be able just to be friends the way they were, because Saul is so determined. So I don't know. It may be that he's just trying any way he can think of to work this situation out. But anyway, David's like us. He's human. And so the Bible does not say, good job, David, and tell us there are situations where, if you got to tell a lie to get out of trouble, go ahead. God had told him he was going to be king. Faith should have driven home that fact. Well, wait a minute. Saul wants to kill me. God sent his prophet Samuel to anoint me and to say, you are going to be the next king of Israel. Well, God's going to protect me. God's given me his word. Somehow or another, God means for me to be king. And that means I'm going to be king. So he's not going to kill me. Now, that's easy for me to say, thousands of years later. But at the same time, you see what I'm saying there? He's growing in faith just like you and I. Hopefully at least, you're not at the same point today in your faith that you were at, the day or the week after you obeyed the gospel. We need to be growing in faith. And David, is just like anybody. Sometimes he needed to grow in his faith. And sometimes you have setbacks along the way with that growth. So anyway, I just want to mention that. The Bible doesn't condone it. And I've heard some really ridiculous stuff from this particular section of Scripture come from some people trying to say things like, well, there are times when if it's for the greater good or your life is in danger, then... Folks, the Bible never says anything of the sort. But one of the evidences of inspiration in the Bible is it doesn't try to whitewash or sugarcoat the flaws of its heroes. It shows everything. And sometimes that's tough because, you think these people are, we can get, if we're not careful, get to thinking that they're sinless, but they're not. They're human. So bear that in mind as we go through this section. Now, picking back up where we left off, Jonathan makes this covenant with David, and he says, look, I know you're going to be king. I want you to show kindness, not just to me, but to my house. What's very interesting about this is that David is going to keep this, isn't he? He's going to keep his word on this. Again, David comes up with this scheme here, and maybe David didn't even think about it at the time. Again, it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't say, well, it's okay to lie if you just don't realize at the time you're lying or something. But he may not have even given it a whole lot of thought. As he said this plan, okay, when the feast comes around, tell your father I've gone back to Bethlehem to be with my family. He may not have given that a whole lot of thought, just being a blatant lie. It still was. But David is a man that he's striving to be honest. And so I just, again, all that is not to try to justify it, but just to say don't lose sight of, here's a man who, big picture, He's a man of God, and he's striving to do what's right. But he does make mistakes because he's human. The same way that I'm a person striving to do what's right, but guess what? I make mistakes. I hope everybody here is striving to serve God, but you're going to make mistakes. So there is encouragement in that, and to learn that, you know what, I'm going to make mistakes, but I can learn from that and move forward and do better. So David is going to keep his word, and we'll see that over in the book of 2 Samuel. He's going to keep his word to Jonathan and to Jonathan's house. So he excuse me. Jonathan calls David to swear again, verse 17, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. Again, you see the friendship of Jonathan and David. Then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow's a new moon, thou shalt be missed, because thy seat will be empty. I've heard some great sermons just using that text to talk about when we miss worship. And it's obviously not the context here, but it's the idea that when there's somewhere where you expect somebody to be and they're not there, they're missed. And so that certainly is true of when it's a worship assembly, but it's also true here in this situation of the family table, the king's table. Jonathan says to David, you're going to be missed because your seat will be empty. So when you've stayed 3 days, go down quickly, come to the place where you did hide yourself when the business was in hand, and shalt remain by the stone Ezel. Whatever he means there, when the business was in hand. Does anybody have a different translation? New King James, what does it say there in verse 19?
It says, and when you have stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place where you hid on the day of the deed and remain by the stone of yourself.
The day of the deed. And again, that's one of those that nobody can really say 100% for sure. This is something that they knew about. And you see this with friends a lot of times. We sometimes refer to inside jokes or something that only that person would understand. And that may be something to do with the whole situation of David being on the run. And even if somebody's eavesdropping, say, remember that first place you and I met? Or remember that, a husband might say to his wife, remember where we went on our first date? Meet me there. Well, somebody else might, what on earth? I don't know where that is. So whatever this is, Jonathan knows that David is going to know exactly where he's talking about. So that's where they're going to meet. So you remain by the stone Ezel. I will send a lad saying, go find the arrows. So Jonathan says he's going to shoot 3 arrows. He's going to tell the lad to go find the arrows. If he says to the lad, behold, the arrows are on this side of thee, take them. Then he says to David, come thou. You take them. Then that means everything's okay. But if I say thus unto the young man, behold, the arrows are beyond thee. Go thy way, for the Lord hath sent thee away. So he'll either tell the young lad who's with him, take them, or he'll say they're beyond thee. So they've worked out this plan to communicate without even having to speak directly to each other. And as touching the matter of which thou and I have spoken of, behold, the Lord be between thee and me forever. So David hid himself. When the new moon was come, the king sat down to eat meat. The king sat upon his seat as other times. It's a seat by the wall. Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side. Abner, of course, later is going to come into be a lot more involved in this narrative. And David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul spake not anything that day, for he thought, something hath befallen him, and he is not clean. Surely he is not clean. He's thinking, ceremonially unclean. He can't sit down to meal because he's ceremonially unclean. Of course, there were regulations in the law of Moses where if you, certain situation, you were not allowed to sit down in the presence of those people because you were ceremonially unclean. So that's what he assumes. Then the morrow, which was the 2nd day of the month, David's place was empty. Saul said to Jonathan, where's the son of Jesse? Of course, that's David. He hasn't come to eat yesterday or today. So Jonathan tells him. Now Jonathan takes up the lie here as well. He said, well, David asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath to sacrifice in the city, and my brother, he hath commanded me to be there, and now if I have found favor in thine eyes, let me get away, I pray thee, and see my brethren. Therefore he cometh not into the king's table. Now, again, I've heard some people, and it's a possibility. Some people have said David really was going to go to this. And that was his plan, was he really would go to Bethlehem, and then he was going to come back and meet up with Jonathan. I don't think there's any indication of that. Or maybe his family really did have a feast, but he just didn't go. But he did actually ask permission to leave to go. Again, I think all that is probably unlikely. I think probably what happens here is you got a man who's just that. He's a man. He's a human. He's fallible. And in a moment of desperation, fleeing for his life, he told a lie. And Jonathan, his friend, in concern for his friend, took part in it. Again, it doesn't make it right, but I think that's probably the most likely explanation of what's going on. Saul's anger gets kindled against Jonathan. Saul is going to just go off again. Saul's kind of prone to do that if you haven't noticed. His anger is kindled against Jonathan. He said unto him, thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion and to the confusion of thy mother's nakedness. What he says here, in fact, there was one version of the Bible that I think is very foolish, but they actually translated it in a very vulgar way. What he says here is, in Hebrew, would be very vulgar and offensive, and it seems he basically is saying to Jonathan, you have shamed and disgraced your mother. And he may very well be making the accusation that some people make against David and Jonathan to this day, that you got a thing for him or something like that. We're not entirely sure what, but we know scholars have said this language that Saul uses here. It's vulgar, it's offensive, and that's how it would have come across to any Hebrew-speaking person. It was just really ugly and off color and completely uncalled for. He goes on, Saul does, it says, as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. He basically says to his son, you idiot, don't you understand? As long as he's alive, you can't be king. And you won't be king. Now go get him so that we can put him to death. You know what happens a lot of times? You'll discover this with people. People often expect you to act how? The same way that they would. And so in Saul's mind, all you would have to do to convince Saul to turn on a friend is to say, he's between you and the throne. And so he expects the exact same thing of his son. Let me spell this out for you, son. The son of Jesse, David, as long as he's alive, you can't be king. And so if you've ever read this and thought, why did he say all that, knowing they're friends, and then say, now go fetch him so that he may die? Did he really think Jonathan was going to do that? I think he did. Because he expected Jonathan to be like him. Because clearly Saul would turn on anyone, even a friend, if it stood between him and his throne. In fact, he did, because what was David before all this? A friend to him. Has David ever done anything out of line toward Saul? No. So he expects Jonathan to be just like him. Jonathan, of course, answers, why? Wherefore shall he be slain? What has he done? So Saul gets angry now at his own son and casts the javelin, again, that's the King James spear, at him to smite him. Jonathan knew then that it was determined of his father to slay or to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger. Jonathan has finally figured this out. His dad is incorrigible at this point. So he did eat no meat the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had done him shame. So then he's going to go out to the field. Jonathan is upset, although it's interesting because Jonathan's going to come back home. And it may be a strong sense of military duty. It may also be a strong sense of familial, family duty that brings him back. Because I've often read this account and wondered, why does he keep going back? Why does he not just make a clean break with his father and say, you are evil, you are wanting to kill an innocent man, simply because you're going against God. God has told you the kingdom's going to be taken away. Even Jonathan says, I know David's going to be king. But he keeps going back. So probably a cultural thing. There's such a strong sense of military. You don't desert the military. You don't desert family. So I would assume, because otherwise, why does he keep going back? But that seems to be a logical explanation. But in the morning, Jonathan goes out to the field at the appointed time, and of course, he shoots the arrows just like they had talked about. And when he shoots the arrows, he sends the lad after him. He says, oh, it's beyond thee, which was the signal that Saul is out to kill David. And so then he tells the lad in verse 38, make speed, haste, stay not. And Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came to his master. The lad, of course, the young boy, he doesn't know anything that's going on. Only Jonathan and David know the matter. So Jonathan gives his weaponry to the boy, and he says, here, go ahead, just run on into the city. Who knows? He may have told him, I'm going to hang out here for a little bit. I'm going to just go walk in the field or whatever. But he gives the lad the weapons and says, take off and take these to the city for me. And of course, all that's to get him gone so he can speak to David without anybody, being able to go back to Saul and say, I saw David talking to Jonathan. So as soon as the lad was gone, David rose out of a place toward the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. They kissed one another. This would be that, you see the Middle Eastern kiss on the cheek. They wept one with another until David exceeded. They're just, they're sad. They know, both of them, it would appear, they know this is it. We have to part. We're going to have to go our separate ways. You're not going to see your best friend anymore. So he actually will get to see him just a little bit very shortly later on. But to their knowledge, this is it. And so they're very upset. No doubt trying times emotionally for David, trying times emotionally for Jonathan to realize your father's trying to kill your best friend. There's a lot going on here. So Jonathan says to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So David now is officially, he's on the run. He's a fugitive. And that's pretty much the way it's going to be until the death of Saul. So David comes to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David and said unto him, why art thou alone and no man with thee? He's afraid because David is alone. Why is he afraid because David's alone? Typically in the military, for any of these, it wasn't just a Hebrew thing, but any of these nations, the military folks, the military commanders don't typically travel alone, do they? You see a military commander traveling alone, you kind of going, what's up here? Did he desert his troops? Did they desert him? Was there a good reason for them to desert him? Is he rogue? Has he just gone rogue now against his master? So you don't know what to think. And here's a priest. He's not a trained man of war, so if David has gone rogue and he's there meaning to do harm, what are you going to do? Little does Ahimelech know, he shouldn't be afraid of David. David says to Ahimelech the priest, the king's commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Well, I've set my servants here and there, and I'm on an errand for the king. What's David doing here? He's lying again. Again, he's human, but it's not right. He's telling a lie. So, what do you have here, Ahimelech? That's basically what he says to him there in verse 3. You guys, give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what there is present. The priest tells him there's nothing but what? There's nothing here but the holy bread, this show bread. And then he says, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. Did that really matter? I think this is the priest here trying to soothe his own conscience. He's a little bit afraid. Well, he's a lot afraid. Here comes a military man. He's a commander. He's all by himself. It's a little shady from the get-go. And he's saying, give me some food. Well, all I got here is the showbread. And he can tell, at this point, he's been gone for a little bit. May very well not have eaten during those 2 days that he missed the feast. Jonathan came out on the third day, so it may be going on 3 days since he's eaten. It may be pretty clear from his body language and all the nonverbal communication that he's going to take that bread whether I give it to him or not. And so maybe Ahimelech says, well, they just showbread, but if they've kept themselves from women, are they pure? I think he's just soothing his own conscience, because there's nothing in the law of Moses that says, don't eat the showbread. Oh, unless, no. So David answers, of course, and says, yeah, sure, they've been kept from women these 3 days since I came out, and vessels of the young men are holy, the bread's in a manner common. Yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So David takes this, and it's clear that what he's doing here is not right. In fact, over in Matthew, I think it's Matthew 12. Yeah, Matthew 12, Jesus is going to make it clear that in fact, he tells those Pharisees, you seek to justify David when David really did wrong, but you seek to condemn Jesus and his disciples when they didn't do wrong. So anyway, he takes of the bread. The priest gave him the hallowed bread. A certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. This is one of the more evil men you will read about in Scripture. There's not a whole lot about this fellow, but every time I read this account, it just gets me perturbed. It really annoys me. So David says to Ahimelech, Doeg just kind of keeping quiet. He's got his eyes and his ears open, like a little sneaky, sniveling thing that he is. David asks, is there under thine hand spear or sword? For I've neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. Again, he's just making stuff up here why he doesn't have his weapons. He doesn't have his weapons because he fled. But the priest said, it's interesting, does he really think he's going to fight against Saul? I don't know what, but anyway. The priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. David said, there's none like that. Give it me. Well, in a sense, this was David's anyways. He killed Goliath. But be that as it may, he takes it. David arose, fled for fear of Saul. He went to Achish, the king of Gath. The servants of Achish, they said, time out. Is this not David? Isn't this the guy that they sang the songs? Saul is slain his thousands, and David is slain his 10,000s. David has gone to Achish here, fleeing for I guess you might even say political asylum. So David lays up these words in his heart, verse 12, and was sore afraid of the Achish, the king of Gath. So David is going to change his behavior before them. He's basically going to pretend to be crazy, right? He feigned himself mad in their hands and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, let his spittle fall down upon his beard. He just makes out like he's just completely nuts. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, you see the man is mad. Wherefore then have you brought him to me? They bring him before Achish. Look, this is the guy. He killed his 10,000s of Philistines. Gath, of course, is one of the chief cities of the Philistines. What are you going to do about it? And Achish says, man, that guy's crazy. I'm not going to do anything. He's out of his mind. I don't need any madmen around here. I don't want him coming into my house. So David departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. When his brethren in his father's house heard it, they went down thither. So now his family comes to him. Then, verse 2, everybody who's in distress, everybody who's in debt, everybody who's discontent with the kingdom, maybe, politically upset, they don't like the direction of the country, so they're going to go fall out to David. Maybe here's some people that they owe the king debt. They don't want to have to pay off their debt. So they fall out to David. People that are in distress, just being mistreated by the king perhaps, they fall out to David. These are probably a lot of good people, but there are also probably some pretty questionable, shady folks in here as well, right? So they fall out, and he became captain over them. There's about 400 men. David goes to Mizpah of Moab. He says to the king of Moab, let my father and my mother, I pray that he come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. So he basically says, I need my family to stay here. And so they did. The prophet Gad comes to David and he says, don't stay in the hold. Get to the land of Judah. David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. Saul heard that David was discovered. And so the men that were with him, of course, Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having a spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Saul says to his servants, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, that you've conspired against me? Nobody shows me. My sons made a league, a pact, a friendship with the son of Jesse, and there's none of you that's sorry for me or showeth unto me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. And man, that was the moment Doeg needed, wasn't it? That was just the little opening that he needed, and he goes through that open door. And he says, sir, I saw David. Yeah, I saw him coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him. Oh, Ahimelech helped him. There are some people that they love to get ahead by putting others down, don't they? Oh, Ahimelech helped him. He gave him food, victuals. Gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sends after Ahimelech, and he basically says, what's up? What are you doing? Why have you conspired against me there in verse 13? You gave him bread, a sword. You inquired of God for him. Ahimelech says, look, who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goes at thy bidding and is honorable in thine house? I'm not conspiring against you. Nobody's told me that you don't like David anymore. Everybody knows he's your faithful servant. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Listen, Ahimelech was not innocent in giving him the showbread. But as far as the conspiracy part, he had no idea. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. The king said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech. What a shock. Saul's just going to decide somebody needs to arbitrarily be put to death. And all thy father's house, he adds. The king says to the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king have more class and dignity and decency than the king. They would not put to Doeg, turn thou and fall upon the priest. And old Doeg, he ain't got, there's no class in him. There's no dignity or decency in him. He fell upon the priest and slew on that day 85 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he smote the city of the priests. And they didn't just stop with the 85 priests. He smote the city with the edge of the sword. Men and women, children and sucklings, oxen, asses, sheep, with the edge of the sword. One of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub,